Hi everyone, it's Amy and today we're making Simplicity 3213. This is a Gunne Sax design that has been reissued from the Simplicity archive. It's a true vintage design, which means all the instructions and construction match the original pattern. If you've never sewn a vintage pattern before, you might find the construction a little unusual in places, but this sew along will help you through. And if you're new to sewing or just need a refresher, don't forget to check out all the helpful tutorials on the Simplicity YouTube account. This romantic dress gets its look from the layers of lace and ribbon trim that are top stitched in place around the dress. It's a lot of edge stitching, so you may want to invest in an edge stitching foot to make it go a little bit more smoothly. You'll also be changing thread colour quite regularly as you move through the construction, so make sure you have enough of each thread colour before you get started. Let's dive in.
I'm making view 2, which features the contrast sheer sleeves and doesn't include the hem ruffle. To get started, cut out all your pattern pieces and interface the neck facings and the cuffs.
So once you've cut everything out, it's time to transfer the important markings. I'm using Burda carbon tracing paper for all my trim lines, and that leaves a light but visible mark on all the pattern pieces. Next, I've got my bodice front and side front. You can see I've transferred all the markings to the back and the trim placement lines to the front. Assembling princess seams can be a little tricky, so why not watch one of our tutorials on how to get the perfect matched curves if this is your first time using princess seams. I'm matching all the notches and the edges and then working my way around. Some people prefer to pin their princess seams with the excess at the front and some from the back. I like doing it this way so I can see the curve and lift the fabric and then curve it around my fingers as needed to get a good pin. Once you've pinned one side, go ahead and pin the other and then sew your seams. Now, when it comes to notching your curves, I'm of the rule of thumb that press everything to the center front, which means you only have to clip or notch the underside of your princess seam. Then you can go ahead and press that and finish any raw edges. If you prefer, you can clip and notch and press the seam open.
Now it's time to attach your narrow lace trim to the bodice. We're attaching 4 rows of trim to the 2 outermost lines on each side of the bodice. Then you'll edge stitch in place along the inner edge.
I decided to use a quite open lace trim. You might prefer a broderie trim or something that has one solid edge and one scalloped edge, and then you would place the straight edge of that trim along the placement line. I'm placing the straight edge of the ladder trim instead, which means it overhangs slightly across the trim line. You're going to pin all 4 pieces in place and then top stitch down one side to hold them securely.
Edge stitching can be quite tricky.
If you're going to use your regular machine foot, position the trim along the edge of your foot and move your needle to be as far right as possible to get a clean line of stitching. With an edge stitching foot, you can use the plastic guide to run along the edge of the ribbon or trim and ensure you're stitching an equal distance away from it. You could either use a 1/4 inch stitching foot and move your needle as much as the needle hole allows. You could use a stitch in the ditch foot and move your needle to sit to the left of the guide, or you could even use a blind hem foot that also has a plastic guide that you could use. When you've got your 4 pieces of lace in place, you're going to come in with ribbon next. Align your ribbon with the placement line and top stitch along one edge to hold in place. I'm going a little bit rogue, like I said, because my trim has scallops on both sides, so I'm going to place mine down the center of the gap between the 2 trims. Now it's time to attach our neck lace trim. If your lace has a finished edge, like this example, you place that finished edge just to the left of the seam position at 1.5 centimeters. Unfortunately, my lace is finished on both sides, so I'm going to have to trap that edge inside my facing. After that's pinned in place, you're going to pin 2 layers of lace on top of it if you're following the instructions. Then we're going to place our pressed placket piece on top. This is with each outer edge pressed under by 6 millimeters. This is the coordinating piece that you cut out earlier with the notched center front. That will lay on top and then trap the remaining lace. I've decided to go rogue because my lace is open weave, it's a ladder lace, and I've placed it underneath, but I'll still place my placket on top like shown. Go ahead and top stitch everything in place. Secure the neckline with a row of basting stitches and then place your placket at the center front with a single pin before placing your facing on top to make a nice little sandwich. My neckline is going to be quite bulky because of that additional lace in the seam line. Yours should be a lot easier to turn out. You're going to sew around the entire neckline, making sure that your placket is caught right at the center front but is still loose to swing below.
Clip the facing seam allowance and press upwards.
I then went back in and I added some ribbon trim on top. This is an optional step. You could add ribbon before you add your placket or afterwards. Then I've top stitched down my placket on either side, securing all the layers, and I top stitch my ribbon, leaving the lower edge free. Everything is clipped and notched and turned through so it can be pressed flat. It's quite strange to attach the facing at this stage, but it'll make sense later. For the front skirt, make sure you match the center front notches and pin the 2 skirt panels together. You're going to sew these together with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, but make sure to stop at the large dot. This leaves you a little opening at the top, which will be important for attaching to our bodice. Install 2 rows of gathering stitches on both sides of the skirt front and then pin to the lower edge of the bodice. We're going to gather up all that excess on either side. I like to secure my gathering threads at one end by looping them around my pins, and then we pull the top 2 gathering stitches to draw everything up. This is quite a big skirt, so it's quite dense gathering. And then pinning everything in place, making sure the gathers are even, adjusting them slightly with your finger as needed, and securing through all the layers. Then we're going to repeat everything for the other side of the skirt, and you're going to sew with a 1.5 cm seam allowance, stopping at each center dot, and then press everything upwards. Now you can add ribbon trim to the front waistline. This is again edge stitched in place, and you can make a little fold, a little pleat at the center front to match the basque waist. Time to hand sew on 7 buttons. These are just sewn through all the layers of the bodice and aren't installed with buttonholes. I chose white pearlescent buttons to match all my trim. Now we can move on to the back bodice and attach the back skirt. So make sure you're attaching the correct back skirt to the back bodice, matching those center backs. And then we're doing the same thing again. We're pinning at either end, adjusting the gathering stitches that you've installed and gathering everything up for a neat fit. You want to make sure that your gathering starts at 1.5 centimeters from either side to give you room to sew your seams later on. Adjust with your fingers and pin everything in place, matching the raw edges. Repeat for the other center back. When sewn, press everything upwards and remove out those gathering stitches. Don't forget to finish any raw seams using the method that you prefer. Once we've got our 2 center backs, we can add a zipper. I used a invisible zipper because that was the best colour match I had in my stash, or you could use a central regular zipper if you prefer to match the instructions. Now we're going to lay our front and backs together and attach at the shoulder seams. So matching at the armhole, the shoulder seam will go partially across and leave a 1.5 centimeter gap at the end on the back. Then we're going to place our back facing on top, making a sandwich and aligning that neckline edge and the shoulder seam. So pinning through all the layers, it will match, the 2 facings will match up at the seam point. and then you can sew across the shoulder and around the neckline with a 1.5 centimeter seam. You'll notice there is a bit of overhang where your zipper is finished and folded back. That's intentional, and we'll deal with that overhang in a second. Once you've sewn your seam, go ahead and clip the curved neckline edge. And I also recommend reducing a bit of the bulk at that corner. For the zipper tape, maybe reduce a little bit of bulk with some seam allowance there. And then we're going to press back that overhang so it aligns with the zipper, and then fold down so it sits behind the zipper tape, hidden out of view, creating a nice facing finish. Now we can pull through the corner for a lovely clean facing, and you can see everything's aligning beautifully. For the ties, fold in half, matching the small dots, and then pin along the length, but you do not sew the end with the dots.
Don't forget this is a narrower than normal seam allowance.
I recommend pressing your seam allowance like shown and then turning through before pressing flat for a lovely crisp corner. Our finished ties can now be attached to the back bodice. The folded edge goes at the top and the seam goes at the bottom. This is aligning with the small and large dots that you made earlier. Match them up with the seam point and pin in place. Pin them on both sides of the body, and then you're going to place the dress front on top and pin the entire length of the side seam, making sure to match the waist seam points and all the notches. Sew both side seams with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance.
Now it's time to work on our sleeve. You're going to sew a line of stay stitching through the 2 dots on the lower edge of the sleeve. Then you're going to clip up to, but not through, the stitching line. You're going to press the little opening once and then twice up onto the wrong side of the sleeve and pin in place. Then we do a small little row of top stitching across that short edge. This is what it looks like when it's complete, and you can go back in and unpick your stay stitching after you're done. You might want to go in and add a small blob of fray check to each of the short ends of that folded up seam, because they will be exposed on the finished garment. So because my sleeve fabric is quite sheer, I decided to use a French seam. Simplicity have a video tutorial for this if you want, but essentially you sew a very small 6mm seam with wrong sides together, and then you turn that right sides out, fold right sides together and stitch a second seam at 9mm. What you end up with is a lovely enclosed seam that's very strong, very stable, and a bit more attractive for a sheer fabric like this. Now that that sleeve is assembled, we've got rows of gathering stitches around the sleeve cap between the dots, and then we've got rows of gathering stitches around the hem around that open little facing area. Next up is preparing our cuff pieces. So this pattern instructs that you interface the cuff, not the cuff facing. And for the cuff facing, you fold back and press the edge to 1.5 centimeters, then trim down to half the width. Place the 2 cuff pieces right sides together and pin around the outer edge. Then you'll go ahead and sew that with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Once that's all sewn, trim off the bulky corners, and as this is quite sheer fabric, I'm also going to go in and grade my seam allowance down to half its width, so less shows through from the right side. Again, pressing the seam allowance in different direction helps you get a nice clean crisp corner, and that's ready to be turned through to the right side and pressed flat. Now it's time to attach our cuff. So the big dots should match together. You see how I'm placing the cuff inside the sleeve, and there's a second dot that matches at the underarm seam, and then finally match the final dot with the other edge of the opening. Now we're going to gather up those gathering stitches just as we have done before, evenly distributing the fullness until the cuff fits perfectly. Pin all those gathers in place, making sure they're all even and raw edges align. Once that's sewn and pressed, fold over the edge of your cuff,
covering the seam line that you've sewn before. Pin everything down, working your way around the cuff, and then you're going to top stitch from the front, from the right side. I like to use my edge stitching foot for this as well because you can get a nice equal distance from the seam line. The cuff is quite clever. This opening is essentially where the buttonhole is folded over and the button will secure all the layers. Here's the finished sleeve with all the edge stitching around the upper cuff edge and that working button cuff detail. Now it's time to install our sleeve into the bodice. Start by checking you've got all your dots accurately marked and your front and back notches. Place your sleeve into the armhole, right sides together, and first match the side seam with the side seam of the sleeve and pin that in place. Then match the notch at the top of the sleeve cap with the shoulder seam of the bodice and pin those together. Always try and pin at the seam line. It will make things much easier when it comes to installing sleeves. Then you're going to match the notches and the remaining dots so that everything lines up, keeping raw edges even. Now we can begin gathering up the sleeve cap. Same as before, pull on your top 2 basting stitches to begin gathering the fabric. Distribute the fullness evenly, adjusting with your finger as needed, and then pin the gathers in place, matching the raw edges and ensuring everything looks even. Once this is all done on both sides of the sleeve head, we can go and stitch all around the sleeve opening for a lovely finish. All that's left to do is add any extra rows of trim along the placement lines of your skirt and add a big chunky vintage hem to the bottom of the dress. So here's my finished version of the dress, made in rich blue chambray with white trim and white voile sleeves. I love it so much, I think I'm going to have to make this pattern again. So there we have it, the end of the sew along, and you should have a gorgeous Gunne Sax dress of your own. I can't wait to see everyone's versions popping up on social media. Make sure to check out the rest of the Gunne Sax collection on simplicity.com, and happy sewing everyone!